Thank you for being here.
Of course.
Okay, so how long have you been a visiting professor at USF?
This is my 5th year at USF.
And what classes do you teach?
I've taught a few. So I've taught Con Law 1, Con Law 2 this year, Remedies, Education Law, and Crim Law.
From those classes, which one is your favorite to teach?
I like Education Law a lot. It's a small seminar in which we have about 20 students. Everyone does a paper. It's very social justice oriented. All the students are great. I love Con Law a lot too because that's my passion. That's where I usually write in. Although Education Law is kind of just a Con Law course in of itself. Not that I don't love Crim and Remedies, but in terms of my passion and where I usually write and what I care about most, probably those classes.
Okay, so I'm gonna just ask some questions about the article that you wrote for the forum, Religious Liberty, Rural Identity, and Same-Sex Marriage. So in the forum, I know that the piece that you are publishing in the forum, it discusses part of your upcoming article on rural resentment and LGBTQ equality.
Mm-hmm.
So for the readers who have no background on your upcoming article, can you maybe give us like a little quick synopsis on what your paper is about?
Sure, it's kind of a theoretical piece, a bit political. It's not what I intended to write. So this piece was actually born out of the 2016 election when now President Trump won. I was surprised. I think a lot of us were. So I wanted to, after that happened, I sort of switched gears and I wanted to really write about kind of the modern state of American politics as it relates to civil rights and as it in particular relates to LGBTQ rights. And I wanted to think about what role does anti-gay and anti-queer or anti-trans sentiment play in sort of the modern populist conservative movement. So that's kind of what the piece is overall about. And it identifies basically a rural-urban divide in terms of the way that anti-LGBTQ politics plays out. And I could speak a little bit more to that with respect to the specific piece for the forum, but that's the overarching sort of thrust of the piece, is looking at what, to the extent that so many rural states oppose same-sex marriage to begin with, now that we have same-sex marriage legalized as per Obergefell, where has all that anti-LGBT sentiment gone? And a lot of it does seem to be on geographic lines, urban versus rural, as reflected in this sort of conservative populist movement.
I see. And at the center of the article that you wrote for the forum, you just mentioned there are really two seminal cases, the cake shop case and the Obergefell case. Can you maybe give us a little bit of background on both of these cases?
Sure. So Obergefell is the result of over a decade of litigation in federal courts challenging statutory and state constitutional same-sex marriage bans. Kennedy wrote the opinion, struck down all same-sex marriage bans across the United States. The rationale essentially sort of hinged on both a fundamental right to marry, as including same-sex couples, and an equal protection analysis as sort of an unequal denial of dignity to people who are in same-sex relationships. So we get Obergefell in 2015. It's a 5-4 opinion, so sharply contested. Then we get Masterpiece Cake Shop this summer, so June 2018. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of the sort of the conservative follow-up to Obergefell, in that now that same-sex marriage is legal everywhere, there's a backlash. And a lot of the backlash we're seeing is coming in the form of First Amendment challenges to laws that would otherwise protect same-sex couples or prevent discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. So Masterpiece Cake Shop was in particular about a religious baker who objected to making a cake for a same-sex wedding. And Colorado's civil rights law purportedly required the baker to bake the cake. It considered the Colorado Civil Rights Commission considered the denial. So the Colorado Civil Rights Commission considered the denial of baking this cake to be a violation of its civil rights law. And so the baker took the case all the way to the Supreme Court, argued that requiring him to bake this cake for a same-sex couple violated his religious freedom, and it was compelled speech. And so the Supreme Court ultimately ruled in favor of the baker, but on very, very narrow grounds, essentially saying that the Civil Rights Commission below that heard the claim expressed hostility to his religious beliefs, and in particular really relied on one statement by one commissioner that talked about the ways in which religion can be used in harmful and derogatory ways. And Kennedy, writing the opinion, thought that that was dismissive of his Christian beliefs. So those are kind of the two bookend cases that the piece touches on.
And in that piece, just briefly, you mentioned that the Obergefell decision, following that, do you think that Kennedy, when he wrote the masterpiece Cake Shop, was that a way of him to kind of tilt the balance or tilt the shift in some ways?
I think that, well, Kennedy was a swing vote. I think that he looked for compromise when he could find it. Kennedy has been a little bit odd on, or across the board on LGBT rights in various decisions. So he's, on the equal protection front, Kennedy's been very sort of pro-gay in that he struck down lots of laws as violations of equal protection, but he also in several opinions has upheld the First Amendment rights of religious dissenters and free speech dissenters. Boy Scouts of America versus Dale is a good example, where Kennedy wrote the opinion essentially saying that requiring the Scouts to admit an openly gay member would violate their expressive association rights under the First Amendment. So this wasn't all that surprising to see Kennedy rule in favor of the baker on this point, because I think he sees sort of the First Amendment as the check against the Equal Protection Clause in striking that balance between LGBT minorities and religious folks just in general.
So in your article, you do talk about this tension between rural America and urban America. Could you please elaborate on where is this tension coming from and why does this tension exist?
Yeah, I think that part of what the piece does is try to explain sort of where we're getting sort of this divide, this continuing divide about LGBT rights versus sort of conservative America along geographic lines. And what it really does, and this is sort of the theoretical component of it, is suggest that there's two major identities sort of butting heads. With respect to rural identity, what the social science research seems to suggest is that there are commonalities about rural America that inform this identity or culture that from which rural people can draw. They tend to be things like community solidarity, sameness, fitting in, self-sufficiency, and largely Christian, religiously motivated conformity to gender norms and sexual norms, so heterosexuality, and very rigid sort of masculinity and femininity rules. Again, that's not true for everyone who lives in rural America, obviously, but what I'm arguing is that there's sort of a broader identity or a broader culture from which not only people who live in rural America pull, but also just conservative politics more generally pull. On the other hand, you have queer identity or LGBT identity broadly defined. And again, this isn't true for everybody who is LGBT, but there are certain tenets that we think of with respect to LGBT identities as well. A lot of, often sort of fueled by media representations of who we think queer people are. So, these things include things like difference, gender nonconformity, obviously sort of a rejection of Christian demands for heterosexuality, sort of in a very inherent way to the identity itself. A lack of self-sufficiency to the extent that this group requires laws to help them in certain ways, sort of lift them up from past discrimination and present discrimination. And so because these two identity groups are perceived so differently, and they're largely perceived on geographic lines, because what rural America perceives to be LGBT identity, they perceive as largely an urban phenomenon. The media depiction suggests that all queer people live in the city, that's where they flourish, that's where the communities are, and again, to some extent that's true, but it's not the full story. So what I think we're seeing is two competing identities clashing that aren't necessarily as competing as we think they are, but that's sort of the way that the identities have been formed in pop and social culture, from which people can pull and make arguments against the progress of LGBT rights. So if you sort of subscribe to this idea of rural identity and you feel very strongly about sameness and gender conformity and heterosexuality as a core tenet of how you should live your life and self-sufficiency, you're going to look very askance at the LGBT person who claims difference and who claims queerness and who doesn't conform to those norms and who does rely on anti-discrimination laws for help. And so that's really what the piece is getting at, is that there is a cultural divide that is largely geographic in nature.
Well, that's all the questions I have. Thank you so much for your insight, and please do check out Professor Boso's article on the forum. Thank you.
Thank you.